So we've now looked at classical political economy, locating it in a context of mercantilism, a rejection of mercantilism, a rejection of the remnants of feudalism, and an acceptance of the problem of famine, faced with corn laws and tariffs on trade, and the power of the landowning class. We then looked at Marxian political economy and noticed that the problem was now interpreted as the impoverishment of the working classes as economies changed from agrarian to industrial. We saw that that was also assumed as a problem by the neoclassical, the first neoclassical economists, who also worried that poverty assistance to the destitute was aggravating poverty by incentivizing the having of children by those who could least afford to feed them. So impoverishment too, in a context of markets that were not sufficiently free, was assumed to be the problem for the neoclassical economists. We saw that the theories that these different schools provided was also very different. The classical political economists focused on overcoming tariffs and encouraging economies to focus on the production of those things that they had a comparative advantage in. We saw that Marxian political economists wanted to revisit the ownership of the means of production so that workers could continue to have ownership over the things that they produced in line with their species being. And we saw that neoclassical economists wanted to free up markets even further, allowing distribution through markets, through exchange, through the working of price, to do the work of responding to poverty by allowing markets themselves to spontaneously overcome poverty. Today, in week 5, we go down a side alley, as it were, to look at institutional economics. This school is a bit fuzzier, and it's more of a minor school, but it's definitely useful nonetheless. And it was particularly important in the early parts of the 20th century, in both Britain and America, but primarily in America. If you look at the image that I've chosen, it's no longer directly historical. It's not a picture of idyllic rural labour or the destitution of industrial labour in the Industrial Revolution. Here we've got a diagram of production processes, the supply of genes. We've got the raw materials at the top. We've got the fabric being dyed and woven and transported and cut and sewn together. And the point is that there's a whole lot of complexity going on, a complex sequence of processes that requires a whole lot of inputs and outputs. We see waste produced along the way in the graph as well. And all in all, it's a very different picture to the artisanal production of the pre-capitalist era of the classical political economists, where there wasn't this hugely complex division of labour. And it's also an altogether different problem to, or a depiction of economic processes to the Marxian account, which would look at the production process as primarily important. So, in a sense, the picture, the image itself will show or reveals that institutional political economy is really about trying to develop an economic theory to match these complex economic processes. So it will also deal with the globalization of production across geographical pathways. In general, what we'll see is that the institutional economists see themselves as addressing the problem of understanding and explaining how institutions, including norms, shape economic behaviour. And they think that the early neoclassical economists didn't do that well enough. So this is a period in which these processes and the interconnection between the processes is increasingly becoming recognised as essential to understand if we're going to understand who gets what and how to improve those processes. And this is why this account of economics, institutional political economy, emerged at the start of the 20th century, when these when the challenge of understanding these interconnecting markets seems to be seem to weigh very heavily on the economists, who didn't think that the neoclassical economists had done a particularly good job of that. So recalling our approach, we're again going to look at the problem that the institutional political economists accepted as their own. We're going to look at their response, the methodologies they developed, the theories they proposed, the policies that emerge. And then we're also going to apply that critical lens that we do each week. We're going to ask, who gains, who loses, and does it matter? Before we begin, let's consider why an attention to institutions was important for the economists writing in the first part of the 20th century. It was at this stage that more and more economic activity began in cities. So cities really came to take over production. People had been moving already from towns to cities for a long time. But the city became now the hub of economic activity. In America, for example, this is the time at which factory production in cities is increasing rapidly with the emergence of labour-saving devices, household goods like shoes and clothes. These were things that had never before been made by the factories in Britain, which had focused on parts like ball bearings for machines themselves, factories to transform raw goods into finished goods and so forth, primarily like linen and so forth. But we had in America new cities with burgeoning production of labour-saving devices for lower income families for the very first time. Economic activity really did begin to be so clearly located in cities, not towns. Have you noticed too how certain types of economic activity congregate in certain areas? So you can see, for example, that you might have a place in Melbourne, like the Heidelberg factory area, where there's a lot of kitchen cabinet makers. Now you might think, well, wouldn't it be better for those kitchen cabinet makers to be spread across the city? Why is it that they all accumulate? Why is it there's so many in such a small geographical area? Why have they all chosen to do their business there when there's obviously more competitors then? So it's a challenge, it's a question. Have you also noticed that most commodities are produced by large firms via global networks of suppliers? So we saw jeans, for example, being produced by Levi's, for example, with the production of jeans now reliant on networks across the world for sourcing the raw goods, for dyeing them, for creating the denim, for sewing. This doesn't take place in one part of the world anymore. This takes place in global networks. And have you also noticed that most exchanges are repeated and not one-off? Maybe you always go to the same glasses supplier, OPSM. Maybe you always go to the same hairdresser because you've developed a rapport with them. You like the way they cut. I'm sure you can think of many exchanges that you make regularly with the same businesses. You go always to the same coffee shop. You buy your coffee beans from the same place. You like to buy your craft beer from a particular place. You like to go back to similar restaurants. Why is that? These are the sorts of challenges that, behaviours that neoclassical economists didn't really initially try to explain or deal with. But they're problems for the institutional economists because they reflect something about how institutions regulate our behaviours, creating habits and so forth. So to return to that idea of a supply chain for jeans, an institutional approach would allow one to examine all the various factors that might lead a business to locate a part of their supply chain in a particular location. So it might be that labour could be much cheaper somewhere else, but there might be other factors involved, such as transportation costs. There might be transaction costs involved in shifting the business from one place to another. And so after time, a supply chain becomes institutionalized in various locations with various other agents and actors involved. And the institutionalist approach tries to shed light on all of those contributing institutions, all those institutions that structure the supply of genes. And now we have global supply chains, institutional interactions on which the production and distribution of your goods rely. This map indicates the supply chains for a range of well-known goods: Apple iPhones, laptop computers, Levi jeans, pharmaceuticals, Toyota cars. And we can see how interconnected they've become, and also how far removed from each other they are in terms of location. An institutional approach, an approach that pays attention to institutions and how they structure and influence economic activity, can also throw light on patterns of cumulative causation. Gunnar Myrdal, for example, argued that close analysis of institutions and their effects could show a cumulative effect of racial discrimination. Racial discrimination produces effects that beget further discrimination, he argued. For example, in 1944, he published an analysis of discrimination of African American people in the US. And the argument was that there's a vicious cycle going on by which African Americans were oppressed by white people and oppressed by the institutions of government led by white people, which in turn led to poor material outcomes for African Americans, which then justified further discrimination. Lesser outcomes in employment were then the result of initial discrimination. So the state delivers poor services, for example, and African Americans are less educated and have less good access to healthcare. And then this lower education and worse health becomes a justification for their discrimination because they're purportedly performing less well, which justifies discrimination against them in the workplace. Also, Gunnar Myrdal argued. So it's this persistent downward spiral. And the answer then is to either improve the circumstances of African Americans, which would reduce white prejudice, or reduce white prejudice, which would improve the conditions facing African Americans. So there's a kind of circularity here. And you can make the same argument for unemployment. They say, for example, that it's easier to get a job if you've already got one than if you're trying to get a job from being unemployed to begin with. That's that similar kind of circularity. And that's different to equilibrium. The pendulum doesn't swing back naturally to settle at an equilibrium if you've got this kind of downward cumulative causation going on. And the idea is that a neoclassical approach, which would just look at employment in terms of supply and demand, what employers are willing to pay and whether workers are willing to accept that, doesn't explain the persistence of unemployment among certain groups. Only institutions do, and cumulative causation. And this is helpful, right, if we want to intervene to try to increase unemployment among people who are long-term unemployed. So those were some preliminary reflections about initial differences between neoclassical economics and the focus of institutional economists on the institutions that regulate and influence economic behaviour. Let's now turn to part one, where we're going to look at the problem. To my mind, there are at least three problems to which institutional economists seek to respond. And the first is the problem of understanding and explaining how institutions, including norms, shape economic behaviour. And there's also the problem of understanding how to achieve an ongoing basis for economic prosperity. And then there's the perceived problems with the way that neoclassical economists explain economic behaviour. So, in terms of historically situating institutional economics or situating institutional economics in the history of economic thought, this third perceived problem is the big one. And so it's significant that institutional economists first originated in the early part of the 20th century, once the neoclassical framework had become increasingly widespread, with the work of Marshall, Pareto, Jevons, Voros, Menger, and others. So the institutional economists were responding in part to what they saw as problems with the views of these aforementioned thinkers. There are other precise problems specific to a particular historical moment too. So we can say the historical problem was problems with neoclassical economists and how they explained economic behaviour without reference to the institutions that influenced that behaviour. But we can also say that because institutional economists started paying attention to institutions, they perceived other precise problems specific to particular contexts that hadn't been formulated by economists as problems as such. So, for example, to provide a concrete example, the institutionalist consumer economists of the early part of the 20th century in the US, they only occurred in the US. This was a distinctly US phenomenon. Why? Well, they were trying to understand why low-income, working-class family consumption hadn't been studied by economists. Well, it hadn't been studied in Britain because there wasn't very much consumption for low-income, working-class families. Low-income, working-class families couldn't purchase shoes. They couldn't purchase clothes. They couldn't purchase a great deal of products that began to be available in the US in the factories for the first time in the early years of the 20th century, leading up to the Roaring Twenties. So the institutionalist US economists started to ask, well, how can low-income families improve their consumption with supporting institutions? Now, this wasn't a question that the early neoclassical economists formulated their theories in Britain and Europe in the latter part of the 19th century had even posed as a problem. But it was a problem for the early 20th century family and consumer economists who identified with this institutionalist strain. So they became interested in things like the purchasing power of families, the availability of goods, what sorts of goods were being provided by factories, labour-saving devices, how consumers might be protected from the disproportionate power of producers. That became a very key theme in this period. This led to labelling laws around the regulation of weights and measures. It led to competition watchdogs. It led to regulations around refunds and around advertising. Advertising had to be true advertising, not false, and so forth. And this was led by the consumer institutional economists in the first 30 years of the 20th century in the US. Why? Well, because there were, at that point in time, we saw the first factories emerging in the Midwest cities, with factories producing labour-saving devices for families, shoes, clothes, mass-produced clothing, fridges, irons, washing machines, etc., for the very first time, leading to what we now refer to as the Roaring Twenties. Neoclassical economists had not studied this and could not really explain this, but the institutional economists, with their attention to institutions, could. So there were precise problems specific to particular historical moments that could then become visible as problems that the neoclassical economists had not really thought about before. So institutional political economy, then, if we were to try to summarise what they're concerned with, it considers the effects of power relations, the disproportionate power, say, of the producer over the consumer, the fact that consumers had to rely on advertising, but there were no regulations to ensure that the advertised good was actually going to be the same as the good, these sorts of things. Social relationships, the fact that the Second World War had led women to work in factories in the US. And when the war ended, social unrest led the housing associations to combine with government to encourage low interest loans for mortgages in order to create consumers. So we see social relationships also having an impact upon a burgeoning consumer market, fostered and promoted by government and housing policy and low interest loans and so forth. We see history as important. I haven't been able to talk about the precise problems that these institutional economists face without talking about a moment in time. Particular problems in America in the early parts of the 20th century. But we could also talk, if we have this lens, about problems specific to today. So it considers the effects of history and time, space and location and distance too. This was something that occurred, for example, in the US only. Factories producing labour-saving devices occurred first in the US. And so the problem of consumption became a problem in the US much earlier than it did in Europe and in Britain, where economists had totally ignored the problem of how to improve family consumption. So it considers the effects of power relations, social relationships, time, history, space, location and distance on the relationships between capital, labour and the state. We've been talking a lot about institutions, but we haven't really talked specifically about what they are. What is an institution? Well, in your texts for this week, institutions appear as formal or informal societal rules. The rules of a game. The rules of the game of a particular society and economy. They include practices, conventions, formal laws or customs. They're socially constructed. They produce and enforce shared, standardised modes of interacting between agents, people, firms, government officials, and this enables effective coordinated action. Institutions are themselves affected by their own effects on individuals and groups. So the institutions themselves are not static. Institutions both constrain, like the rule like thou shalt not kill, and they also provide predictability and facilitate collective action. So it's a rather encompassing account of institutions, both in terms of societal informal rules as well as formal legal rules, as well as policies around welfare, around the regulation of interactions between people, who gets what. And the way that the term institutions is used in the text that you're studying is quite diverse in this way. So one will need to be attentive to what kind of institution is being studied. What is its nature? What are its effects? What are the effects of its effects on it? And so forth. You could do that, for example, with the consumer watchdogs that were pioneered in the US as a response to concerns about producer duplicity and about the power of the producer of the consumer. Those consumer watchdogs in turn had an effect on consumption itself, allowing people to buy more and buy more because there was greater levels of trust with suppliers to benefit from this increased consumption and a focus on goods for low-income families rather than for the aristocratic elite. Why are institutions important in explaining economic behaviour? Well, institutional economists are different to neoclassical economists in that they still think price is important, yes, of course, but they don't see price as the most important factor in explaining behaviour. Neoclassical economists often refer to their theory as price theory because the exchange of goods is made possible through price, and price regulates and informs that transaction and exchange. The equilibrium price reflects the market clearing price that buyers and sellers are both the amount that a supplier is willing to supply to the market at a certain price is exactly equivalent to the amount that a buyer is willing to purchase. Price plays that role of regulating. But institutional economists say price really is only one very small part of economic activity, part of the explanation for economic activity. We need to pay attention to institutions as well, and institutional arrangements are as important, perhaps more important than price. Ronald Coase, for example, said that studying economics without studying institutions is like studying the movement of blood without reference to the body. One example that's quite elucidating, and you can ask Jessie about this in tutorials, since Jessie is studying the philosophy of money. We can see the emergence of money as an institution that facilitated economic activity in this sense. Indeed, there was a debate in the late 19th century between chartalists or institutionalists versus metallists or neoclassical economists. Now, Menger and Jevons belonged to the metallist neoclassical view, and they put forward an explanation for the origins of money that went something like this. They argued that when barter became too cumbersome, when it was difficult to find what you wanted and pay for it in the exact type of good that your transacting partner was seeking, when, for example, if I wanted corn and my partner wanted bread, but I only had rice and they had the corn that I needed but wanted bread, then barter was pretty stuffed, right? So as markets grew and barter became much more cumbersome, the idea, according to the metallists, is that precious metals spontaneously arose to provide the key functions of money. The key function of money was as a means of exchange. And the idea was that at this time, this was a major innovation because it was way more efficient. Money was more efficient. Metals were more efficient than barter. You could carry a couple of gold coins to the market to do your shopping, and that was much more convenient, for example, than lugging around your cows, lugging around bags of rice, and having the problem of wanting to buy something with, I don't know, only half a cow, or with rice that nobody wanted because they actually wanted corn, bread, that sort of thing. So money was made out of precious metal, and that was visible, and it's portable, and it's durable, and it has low carrying costs. You don't have to feed it to keep it alive. You don't have to stop it from getting mildew and rotten. And so that's the theory of money that the metalists, the neoclassical economists like Jevons and Menger put forward as an explanation for the origins of money. But on the other side, you had the historical school who offered an institutionalist reading. Although this was a bit before Veblen and a bit before before institutional economics had become its own school of thought, we can still see the historical school as demonstrating institutional analysis. And the historical school says, no, money didn't arise spontaneously from markets. Money is primarily a unit of account, not a means of exchange. And its real origins are in accounting for debt and paying taxes. Taxes means power. Taxes means social power. It means political power. So identifying the origins of money in paying taxes means money's origins are deeply socially embedded. And this is the chartalist or institutionalist reading of the origins of money, that it's essentially about state power. And that's totally antithetical to the neoclassical reading of money coming about in order to overcome the problem of barter being too cumbersome. It's an important difference because the institutionalist approach would allow you to view money through the lens of power, whereas the metalists and the neoclassical approach would view money as a spontaneous market invention. The institutionalists would say money is deeply embedded in social relationships. It couldn't become money without those social relationships. So, as Ronald Coase will say later, it's like studying the movement of blood without the body. It's half a truth that misses most of the action. So neoclassical economists only really see half the truth. And they miss most of the action. They don't see the social structures and relations of power in which money is embedded. So this historical school, the chartalists became this chartalist school. And although it was before the period in which we now refer to as institutional political economy, it's a helpful example of the difference in perspective and the different explanations that are possible when you take institutions as key as opposed to market and price. Ask Jesse more about this example if you'd like to in the tutes. I'm sure he'll have some interesting insights to offer. So we looked earlier at institutions, but let's provide some examples to try and make it more concrete. There are formal institutions like property rights, government, contract law. There are informal institutions like repeated transactions, you going to the same coffee shop, developing a rapport with a barista, enjoying the walk across the park, and being committed to that experience, even when a coffee shop nearby opens up with cheaper coffee. There's the interdependence of tiers in supply chains, like the production of the supply of jeans. It's hard to change one of those intersecting elements of the supply chain when they're so closely interdependent with each other. There's national cultures, tea-loving Brits, coffee-drinking French. Interest-based subcultures, surfers and fashion. There's the gender order. My brother lived in Singapore for a while, and in Singapore there's a hierarchy, if you like, of maids who come from different countries, Filipino, Malaysian, Indonesian, Indian. There's no, these are all women, and they have different prices. They're gendered jobs, and those prices are given by transnational labour flows. What price women from different cultures are willing to accept. It's a convention based on the backgrounds and expectations of the maids in the different countries. Informal institutions. An example is also interdependent locations in time and space. Sally Weller, who taught this subject a couple of years ago, pointed out that Hong Kong became a hub for fashion and brands, primarily due to its location in that it could serve to link European desires with cheap Chinese production. Hong Kong's location, its culture, its institutions permitted businesses there to play this facilitating role, and it became a hub for fashion. The economic geography of markets. I thank Antonia Settle for the money example. Antonia taught the subject last year. And then there are both formal and informal institutions that vary over time and place. What one requires to appear in public without shame is also a function of cultural and temporal context. Adam Smith made the point that at a certain point in time, linen shirts were a necessity, but shoes were not. Shoes were a necessity in Britain, but they weren't in France, and these are norms that differ according to time and place. And people know what those norms are because they want to avoid public shame. This was taken up by the institutional consumer economists in the US, who identified standards of living that were needed for low-income families to avoid public shame. And this became a basis for taxation levels and the like. Then there are formal and informal institutions that are interdependent. We can see, well, I should say that again. These formal and informal institutions are interdependent. Formal institutions also rely on informal institutions in this way. Now, I've said earlier that what we refer to in the history of economic thought as institutional political economy dates back to the very last years of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. This period, particularly in the US, was called Old Institutional Political Economy. And we'll look at Veblen and the impact on methodologies of these early old institutional political economists in a moment. The idea resurfaced in the late 20th century as a form of new institutional economics, which built institutions into neoclassical analyses, trying to merge the perspectives in some way. The idea, for example, of transaction cost economics was developed to try to explain why, even if some women, for example, or some non-white persons might be just as equipped to have just as much human capital and be just as productive as men and white individuals. Transaction cost economists would say that it might cost more to do the research into the background, education and experience of women and non-white persons. And these transaction costs make it more expensive for businesses to take the risk of employing a woman or a non-white in a context where most women and most non-whites at a particular point in time were known to have less education, less human capital. So an attention to institutions has been built into neoclassical economists to sometimes explain why the racial discrimination and gender discrimination persist, even though there are women and non-whites who are just as good and just as productive as men and whites. So we come to part 2, where we look at the way in which the institutional political economists developed methodologies and theories in response. These are varied methodologies, but they're united around careful empirical observation, induction. This is not a deductive account of abstract reasoning like the neoclassical economists. Instead of saying, well, how would a person choose given certain budget constraints of time and income? Well, they choose in this way, says the neoclassical economists. We know deductively they'll do that, independently of any experience. The institutionalists undertake inductive, which means based on experience, inductive experiments and inductive empirical observations to try to determine laws of human behaviour. But they're still varied, the methodologies. They can be quantitative, like Wesley Mitchell, who compiled enormous volumes of statistical data to describe and analyse the cyclical character of economic growth. Measurement without theory, his critics used to call it. The origins of economic statistics lie in this approach, and it later became econometrics, quantitative empirical observation through induction. We see this also in the consumer economists, who determined that the consumption of farming families would not necessarily change even in a bumper year. Even though one would expect consumption to increase in a bumper year, farming families wouldn't necessarily spend because, like their urban city counterparts, because they wanted to ensure permanent income first. So the permanent income hypothesis was designed to explain why consumption of farming families would not go up like the consumption of urban families when incomes rose. That was a quantitative approach drawn from empirical observation. Then there are qualitative examples and methodologies. Veblen, we'll look at in a moment, looks at historical and qualitative, provides historical and qualitative analysis of the root of economic growth, pecuniary emulation. In all of this, there's a shared assumption that individual preferences are shaped by the social world and not just given. It's self-consciously interdisciplinary too. It recognises the importance of history, even if the methods of studying this vary considerably. It also unites around that idea that I mentioned earlier of circular and cumulative causation. This is defined by Stilwell as the processes whereby the political economic condition at a point in time shapes subsequent political economic changes, causing greater divergence from the initial condition. Small differences thereby become magnified and economic inequality relentlessly increases. This isn't equilibrium, right? The neoclassical schools view markets as self-correcting, with prices carrying information that signal to markets how much to produce. And if there's some kind of shock, then it's going to balance out the market. The market's going to naturally equilibrate the prices and bring markets back into equilibrium. But we don't see that analysis in institutional economics. Institutional economics is about dependency and cumulative causation. So one thing feeds onto another and snowballs. As we said earlier, discrimination causes more discrimination, and so on. So faced with certain shared characteristics, but also a sheer variety in methods, perhaps the best approach to understanding how the institutional political economists respond is to analyse a handful of important institutional political economists, those reflected in your readings. We'll begin with Thorstein Veblen, an American institutional political economist who analyses economies qualitatively, not through quantitative analysis at all. And to intuitively help us understand this week's lecture, I've provided you with two images. The first is of the workers' tenements in the late 19th century in Brooklyn. And the second is a Queen Anne mansion, also of this era, from the late 1800s, in 1890. You can see the difference here. On the right-hand side, in the Queen Anne mansions, we've got rooms filled with trinkets and goods from the colonies. We've got rugs, carpets, paintings, lovely knives and forks, and all of this posed Herculean tasks of housekeeping, requiring domestic servants. On the left-hand side, as you look at it, you've got the working class tenements, and these share amenities. There are no internal laundries and toilet facilities in each apartment. These are shared toilets, shared laundries, shared facilities in pokey apartments with a very large amount of people living in them. The furnishings in the tenement apartments would also be made by people themselves, not bought. They would be simple and non-decorative. We don't have many consumable items for sale for people during this period, for low-income working class families during this period. We can see the difference in the consumption patterns and habits. The factories that produce labour-saving devices and household goods have not yet taken off in America. That won't happen until the first decades of the 20th century. And you can see that striking difference between the two types of abodes. Let's turn to Veblen now. Thorstein Veblen is often considered to be the father of institutional economics in America, and he wanted to explain why consumption had taken the form that it did. Remember, we're in the very late 1800s here, and the very early 1900s. So the argument of Veblen is that the purpose of the acquisition and accumulation that occurred during this period was not the satisfaction of physical needs at all. It was rather about pecuniary emulation. By that, he means that the elite aristocratic families are trying to fill their Queen Anne mansions with goods in order to achieve the esteem of their peers through their purchases, through goods from the colonies, through afternoon teas, through cutlery, through nice goods, through carpets, and so forth, through lavish expenditure on consumable items that I said pose Herculean tasks for a housekeeper, requiring domestic servants. So consumption in this period is really about pecuniary emulation for the elite, for the bourgeois, for the owners of the Queen Anne mansions. The need for subsistence may, for a time, be the dominant motive of acquisition for the working factory classes, but economic growth, Veblen argues, arises from conspicuous consumption through a competitive desire for status. That's the deeper point of your text, that forms of consumption, conspicuous consumption of the late 19th century are invidious. That means socially harmful, because the production of commodities has been oriented towards the motive of pecuniary emulation by the well-off. The well-off have controlled production due to their purchasing power. And this is something the consumer economists following Veblen in this tradition of institutional economists will be concerned with. The well-off in their Queen Anne mansions have controlled production due to their purchasing power. And this is at the expense of the working class factory families who have had very few commodities within reach of their purchasing power. If you look at Gilboy's history of consumption that she writes later in about 1960, she writes, really, there was very little for the working classes to consume during the period in which Veblen wrote. Consumption didn't exist for the lower classes. They were still making the things that they needed. Shoes, clothes, etc. Note how Veblen's interest in consumption was taken up by the quantitative institutionalist economist Wesley Mitchell, who asked why economists had not studied consumption explicitly, why had economists up to that time preferred to focus on production? Mitchell's question paved the way to work by the first disciplinary economists who were women: Hazel Kirk, Elizabeth Hoyt, Margaret Reed, who were the first women to be employed in economics departments, in joint appointments between home economics and economics. And they studied the consumption of low-income families and analysed the institutions that would be needed to support improved consumption. And so Veblen's analysis of the late 19th century bourgeois aristocratic classes and their consuming habits in terms of pecuniary emulation gave rise to a criticism of why it was that factory families hadn't had a chance to consume. And this also led to the shift of production to target low-income families in America in the first decades of the 20th century. You'll have to wait for my book on this, Economics and the Family, A Social and Political History, which is really the first book in existence to track the changing ways in which economists have studied families from the 19th century to the present. Let's turn to your other texts for this week by Ha-Joon Chang. And Ha-Joon Chang is talking about how useful the notion of market failure is. It's only useful if we make clear what we're expecting of an ideal market. He implies at one point that an ideal market is one that permits high productivity growth and consequently high standards of living. And this means, he argues, that the neoclassical concept of market failure is not a useful analytical concept. It understands market failure in terms of the failure of markets to be perfectly competitive, and it thus views all other institutions that comprise a capitalist economy as failures. For example, formal producer associations, informal enterprise networks, trade unions, etc. These are all evidence of failure. But often, as Ha-Joon Chang argues, it's these very institutions, these purported failures, that contribute to high productivity growth and high standards of living. So it's more important, according to Ha-Joon Chang, to define the ideal market and assess whether existing institutions facilitate or inhibit its achievements. He makes several further sub-points that are also interesting, but generally he paints this picture of he paints this picture that there's heaps going on in the economy and that the market is just a little portion of that. So there's a real distinction between market and economy from this perspective. The idea is that that neoclassical economics is only capturing one part of the story, and we need to understand institutions to really understand the basis of high productivity and high standards of living. So now on to George Argyros. And this reading is about cumulative causation, and it puts forward the idea that cumulative causation is a linchpin for institutional thought. This model of cumulative causation provides a much greater scope, he claims, than neoclassical economics for the government to alter the trajectory of industrial development in a positive way. So there's much more scope for the state to have an impact in this reading. If prior actions determine future actions, then there's scope for policy to set a path for path dependency, to set things going in a certain direction. By contrast, neoclassical economics views a country as restricted by its natural endowments of resources and its comparative advantage in the production of certain types of goods rather than others. But if we recognise why it is that economic decline occurs, then we might be able to identify ways of intervening using cumulative causation to prevent that decline. Argyros lists 6 factors that can produce a cumulative effect that leads to economic decline. And understanding how to overcome these limits can permit creative interventions to alter the trajectory of industrial development. This, of course, is the nature of industrial policy. So Argyros talks about the car industry, for example, and that's been a real focus of industrial policy in lots of countries, because if you nurture a car industry, then you're going to see growth in a whole range of related industries. If you're shaping economic development, because you start with the car industry and it builds out from there. Similarly with high-tech industries, fostering research and development in specific industries. The idea is that industries build up into a cluster and then they build out sideways. And it's a really different approach to a neoclassical approach, which says in theoretical terms that the economy is going to move towards its comparative advantage, which probably isn't cars or high tech or whatever. And in policy terms, the neoclassical approach would say that you shouldn't nurture a car industry. You shouldn't have tariffs or subsidies or any other government programs in this car sector because you end up with more expensive cars. And that's certainly a debate that's played out in Australia over decades. We now have no car industry, and that's something that the Productivity Commission has looked into. So the important point is that it's not just a different theoretical approach, but really the institutional economists have a key commitment to a range of different policy implications that arise from an analysis of the effect of institutions on productivity. This is the idea of cumulative causation. Geoffrey Hodgson's paper is on old and new institutional economics, and I mentioned them on a previous slide. So the central traits of old institutional economics, all of which are absent from neoclassical economics, comprise the idea that individual tastes are not given but shaped by institutional circumstances and by particular influences, like advertising. There's also upward and downward causation between individuals and institutions. Individuals create and change institutions, just as institutions mould and constrain individuals. There's also an enhanced concept of power. With these traits, old institutionalism is more able to address questions of structural change and long-term economic development. But the analysis becomes more complicated and less open to formal modelling in normative terms. Formal modelling. In normative terms, the individual is no longer taken as the judge of his or her or their own welfare. An alternative type of welfare analysis is required, including addressing the difficult question of the discernment and evaluation of human needs. I promise you we are now approaching the end because we're in part 3, critical considerations. So who wins, who loses, does it matter? Well, the sheer diversity of approaches that comprise institutional political economy makes it hard to answer this question. Institutional political economists often ask these questions of a particular economic interaction. And so they are actually asking who wins, who loses, doesn't matter. They're engaging in considering how to define what it is that makes an economic interaction good. And that's quite interesting in itself. So, as Stilwell puts it, the problem of understanding how to achieve an ongoing basis for economic prosperity requires looking at who wins, who loses. And certainly that does matter. But again, notwithstanding differences, many institutional political economists have still conceptualised economic growth as good, given its correspondence with improved standards of living. The texts that we have read do not explicitly consider whether we have responsibilities to the non-human or to humans in future generations. Do we owe to future generations an ecosystem that can sustain their lives? The environment is still a resource to be used rather than a constraint for the institutional political economists that are studied in this week. Whether or not that has to be the case is another question. If one analyzes an economic interaction as good if it is sustainable in supporting an ecosystem able to sustain human life, then you could say that institutional political economy is capable of considering this issue. Next week, we're going to look at feminist political economy, and we'll see that in some senses, feminist political economy grew from a reflection on the ways in which institutions constrained women's roles in the economy, and how, if one is committed to gender equality in economic outcomes as a good effect of economic interaction, then the question then becomes how to design institutions that might support that objective. We will turn, and so feminist economics is sometimes closely related to institutional political economy because it recognises the impact of institutions on behaviour that would otherwise be viewed by the neoclassical economist as purely rational. We'll turn to that next week. See you in Tutes.